Welcome to the Geneva Graduate Institute in Conversation With podcast series.
Professor Gandhi, it is an enormous pleasure to welcome you here to the Graduate Institute.
Thank you.
And it is such an honor for me personally, to be hosting this podcast with you. So I wanted to start by asking you about democracy. Democracy is meant to be on the back foot globally. It's said that it is in retreat. Across Europe, we've seen that far-right and anti-immigrant, almost xenophobic parties have made huge gains. Do you think this argument about backsliding is true, and what would you count as its principal reasons?
Well, I imagine that historians will, in the years to come, give their reasons for what has happened. But here are some thoughts of mine which may be of some relevance. When the Soviet Union ended and the communist parties in Central and Eastern Europe declined greatly, some people believed that a new world of liberty had arrived and that harmony was Europe's natural state. This proved to be an illusion. We know that the Balkan Wars of the 1990s showed that ethnic conflicts were so real. And we've also seen that Europe's traditional parties, Social Democrats, Liberal Democrats, Christian Democrats, Left Democrats, Green Democrats, they could not develop any kind of attractive unity among themselves. They were quite divided, strong, and sometimes sharply divided. And so the far right found a chance to paint immigrants as the problem. And then nationality as a question of bloodlines began to be talked about. But I think there is some evidence also in the opposite direction, looking at the world as a whole. I think it is well understood, and it has to be acknowledged that in some ways democracy is on the retreat in some parts of the world. But then say what's happening in the UK just now. Yes, the Farage group has done quite well. Still, the very large victory of Labour may be seen by some as a sign that democracy is still strong. Yes, the far right also has made some gains, but democracy is the very considerable and large victory of Labour in the UK, I think, may be seen as a sign in the opposite direction. I would say that even the recent Indian elections, where undoubtedly Mr. Modi has come back to power, but so many important parts of India have voted very powerfully, you might say, for democracy. The UP, the large state in the north, West Bengal, the large state in the east, Maharashtra, the big state in the west. So I would say that recent Indian elections will be interpreted by some people as evidence that those who want civil liberties to be accepted are getting popular support as well in countries like India. So then, of course, Myanmar is a country in very great conflict. But the fact that so many diverse groups today in Myanmar, the ethnic groups which were fighting with one another, and the pro-democracy Aung San Suu Kyi, they've come together. They're putting up a very big battle. We don't know what the outcome will be. But that again is an indication that democracy is on the front foot in some parts of the world.
It's interesting that you mention India, because obviously what's happened in India has been, in a sense, counterintuitive. It went against everything that was being predicted by psephologists, by commentators. And what do you think India, with its size, its shape, its ability to manage diversity, what role is India playing in the sort of story of global democracy? And what lessons do you think the recent election in India hold for democracy more generally?
So I would respond to this in two ways. One is India itself, within India, what's happening, including the recent elections. And whereas I have already indicated that there's been a robust expression of support for democracy and against the idea of some kind of supremacy. You know that the anti-democratic trend in the world is often related to some wish for supremacy of a particular group within a country. And so that notion has received, even in the Indian elections, a kind of a setback in certain parts of India, where people have said that, no, we want the minorities of India to have equal rights. This is, I think, a valid interpretation of at least some of the major election results in India. But the other angle that I want to mention here, which may be even more important, is the reality is that India is no longer the only home of the Indian people. The world has become the home of the Indian people. The Indian diaspora is very large and is growing at a remarkably rapid rate, country after country. Wherever you go, smallest countries of Europe, smallest countries of Central Asia. The other day, there was something that happened in the Kyrgyz Republic. And you discovered that there were thousands and thousands of Indians in the Kyrgyz Republic. Recently, I met a person in Maharashtra from a very humble background. And they had a daughter who had just come back from Smolensk in Russia. I asked her, how many Indians live in Smolensk? She said, thousands and thousands. The other day was a report also about Italy and in the farming areas of Italy, very large numbers of Indians. So I think this is an important thing to understand when we speak of India and democracy in the world as a whole. What will be the impact of this very large migration of people of Indian origin to literally every part of the world in very large numbers? We don't quite know. So it remains to be seen whether people of Indian origin, of course, Indians are not the only people who are migrating, but Indians, I think at the moment, the most conspicuous group that is moving across the world. So what will be their role? And here there is one point that I always like to ask myself and ask my fellow Indians. By this time, people of Indian origin have lived in the rest of the world almost for 200 years. So how much of the world have we studied? Indians have been in Africa for a very long time. Indians have been in Europe and even in Western Hemisphere for a very long time. How much of our knowledge of the world of Africa has now come from people of Indian origin? I have, as you may know, done my historical studies about India. And in my historical studies of India, I've been helped not only by Indian scholars, but by scholars of European origin. Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, Danes, British, Germans, French. They have helped us in India to understand the story of India. But with so many Indians in the rest of the world, will Indians now inform the rest of us about Switzerland, about Germany, about France, about Africa? So this is a very important question, which I think Indians also have to ask.
Right. Professor Gandhi, you have written extensively on the Mahatma. And you have, in some senses, you are a historian, but also you are a source in and of yourself. You have witnessed the birth of Indian democracy and the early years of it. And so there's one question that I've been thinking about a lot, and that is on the early years of Indian democracy. Why do you think that so much of Gandhian thought was, in a sense, sidelined in India's democratic experiment? And why were many of his core political principles, in a sense, why did they not make it into India's constitution and its political structure?
I would like to contest this argument of yours. So when you say about the constitution and India's political structure, a core Gandhian idea was that India belongs to everybody. His theory of Indian nationhood, which he first expressed in Hind Swaraj in 1909, a long time ago, and which he never deviated from, that India is the home of all its people, and whether you are Buddhist or Christian or Muslim or Sikh or Parsi or Jewish or anyone, you have India belongs to you and you belong to India, just as the Hindus belong to India and India belongs to the Hindus. So I would say on that very important question of Indian nationhood, Gandhian ideas were actually accepted at the heart of India's political structure. And also, say, during the emergency time, that was a long time ago now, almost 50 years ago. And again, in the recent elections and the recent question of some steps against democracy in India, again, the Gandhi idea or the Gandhi philosophy, Gandhi approach was cited by the fighters for democracy during the emergency and again in recent times. So I think it can be argued that Gandhi is continuing to play a part very much for strengthening basic democratic concepts.
And yet there are others who, and some historians have argued this, and including some of Gandhi's contemporaries, would argue that much of India's Gandhian inheritance, which can be seen in the language of satyagraha, in civil disobedience, has been one of the things that sometimes in a sense, makes India overtly or extra politicized, a form of extra parliamentary democracy, which somehow, sometimes prevents the functioning of parliamentary democracy in itself. Do you think that is a fair criticism that has been and is sometimes made?
I am aware of the criticism that the satyagraha, the direct action, is in some ways not in harmony with democratic ideas. On the other hand, it can also be argued that when the citizen, a weak citizen or a weak group even in a democracy, is not able to get justice through standard democratic institutions, that the course to non-violent direct action gives citizens a fresh avenue. And I think this is a very important question even for the future. If there is you might say, an anti-democratic trend in many parts of the world, the question will arise, can satyagraha direct non-violent direct action, can it also be useful to fight for democracy even where democracy is very seriously threatened in some countries? So it remains to be seen, but I would say that satyagraha, non-violent direct action, while some may have seen it as an extra or a non-democratic way, others, I think, can legitimately see it as a weapon in the hands of those who have faced very great hardships or oppressions, have had no other recourse, but through non-violent direct action, they still have some way of fighting for some justice.
You are a historian and a scholar, but you are also a very prominent example of a scholar taking steps beyond the intellectual world. And while many of us try to influence the world purely through our writing and purely through our scholarship, you've also done that through a very prominent public role and through a lot of activism. I wanted to ask you whether you might want to shed a bit of light on that and what you think is really the role of a scholar or a historian beyond the intellectual world.
Thank you for this very interesting and important question. And I think when reflecting on this question that you have raised, of a book I wrote some years ago on Punjab, the history of partition of Punjab. And it's called Punjab's Story from Aurangzeb to Mountbatten. So the Aurangzeb was the last big Mughal emperor who died in 1707. And Mountbatten was the viceroy when India was partitioned and Punjab was partitioned. And the great killings took place. So in that study, in that book of mine, I try to understand the long-term story of the unsatisfactory relationships among the Muslims, the Sikhs and the Hindus of Punjab. Very important part of undivided India. Very important part today of both India and of Pakistan. And so I wanted, of course, to be a scholar and a researcher, but I was also very keen to see how these great divisions or conflicts among people, among communities can be addressed, can be resolved. So my research into the origins of this violence, and not just the immediate origins preceding the partition of 47, but the preceding 100, 150, 200 years. And I was very gratified that Sikh scholars, Hindu scholars, Muslim scholars in both parts of what once was undivided Punjab, now today it is India and Pakistan, that they seemed to welcome this. And so I found that a scholar, a researcher, can also play a constructive role. Another way in which I would answer your question is this. One of my current projects, which I hope I will complete, is to write a biography of an African-American leader. His name is James Lawson. He just died a few weeks ago. Amazing man. He was 95 years old. Incredible scholar of colonialism, Gandhi, a very great scholar of Gandhi. And he and Martin Luther King were very close colleagues, and King asked him to help in this civil rights struggle in the southern part of the United States. But I felt to myself that Indians are proud to say that Martin Luther King and others in other parts of the world used Gandhian techniques for their battles. But what about an Indian like me who has also been in the United States for some time? Why shouldn't I present the life of this remarkable man so that the rest of the world and people in India too can understand the African American story. So what is it that makes a man like James Lawson tick? Yes, I want to be a scholar and a student of history, but I also want to play a role in enabling, say, people in India or people elsewhere to understand the African American story, which we know of from a distance. Why shouldn't an Indian scholar study this remarkable life? So I've done a fair amount of research and some writing. So if all goes well, if my health endures, this too is an example of the kind of creative or constructive or positive role that I feel that scholars can play.
Which brings me to my question on history, and I'm going to use a quote here from your book, Understanding the Muslim Mind. And you say, history will not dissolve resentments and suspicions. Selective history will in fact harden them, yet a frank and as far as possible non-partisan look at the past can at least tell us of the blocks to Hindu-Muslim partnership. And history will then have served the cause of national and subcontinental understanding. How far do you believe we are, in a sense, prisoners to history? And how far do you think we can transcend our history? It's a quote that really struck me from your book.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'd forgotten that I'd written those lines, but they certainly seem to make sense to me. Yes, I think a frank study of history is essential. And I think scholars have to be very careful to also recognize their own likely prejudices. I remember a time when I first read books by Muslim scholars. I didn't want even to read them because I knew that their version of what happened would conflict with certain things that I had grown up with as a child. But then I studied them and I tried to see really what might have happened and what might not have happened. And it was a necessary growth in my own life to be able to look at facts which were not pleasing to me. I genuinely believe that as far as possible, truthful, honest study of the past, even if it reveals some very harsh and bit unpleasant things, will in the end serve the cause of harmony in the world.
My last question to you, Professor Gandhi, is on the subject of biography.
Yeah.
And you are, again, a rare historian who has used biography very extensively to illuminate the past. And in some senses, many of your subjects, or at least two of your subjects, have been very close to home. Where do you see the role of biography in illuminating the past? And how do you deal with, in a sense, keeping a measured distance from subjects like Mahatma Gandhi or C. Rajgopalachari?
That's a great question. These two people, both grandfathers of mine. Of course, I've written other biographies too.
Of Patel.
Of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan.
Khan as well, true.
Yes. I think one should recognize the bias that likely exists in your mind and be ready to criticize also the people that you love or you honor. I think that is not an impossible task. And of course, readers will decide. Readers will figure out whether this person is trying to be fair or is defending his grandparents or his grandfather or is trying to be as reasonable as is feasible. There's one other point here I might make, both in my biographies and in my histories, as well as in my actual travels to different parts of the world. Having looked at since I've been interested for a long time on this issue of why groups or communities have conflicts and how those can be resolved, I've discovered that when it comes to groups other than our own, most of us have opinions. We don't have knowledge. We have very strong opinions about those other groups. But do we really read about them? Do we really read what they have written? Do we listen to them? Do we seek them out and get to know them? So this, to me, both as a citizen and as a scholar, is a crucial thing. Am I forming my opinions on the basis of whatever, some accidents of life or history, some prejudices, pro or con? Or am I really keen to obtain knowledge through research, listening, and study?
Professor Gandhi, thank you so much for your time and for all of the incredibly erudite answers that you've given. It's been a great pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
For more information about the Institute, please visit graduateinstitute.ch. Thanks for listening.